tonight's Holmes lecture is, ouch, why do toothaches hurt? So we're going to talk about pain and why we experience pain. Now, it'd be really a lot easier if we could inflict lots of pain on you all, and then we'd know that you all knew what we were talking about. Sadly, there's lots of rules that say that we can't do that. Really quite boring. But, so, we're going to focus on toothache. Hopefully most of you have been to the dentist or had a toothache at some point, so you're going to know what we're talking about. But we don't want anyone to be put off going to the dentist. Going to the dentist is a good thing, okay? That's the take-home message. Tonight's is the first of the Holmes lecture. Next week it will be looking inside the body with radiation. So if you haven't signed up for that one, please do so. It's going to be really fun. So, back to tonight's lecture, and we have James from the School of Dentistry, Ilona, who's from the School of Pharmacy, and Wok, who is from our Neuroscience Department. So, without further ado, I think James is first up.
Indeed. Okay, hello everyone, thanks for coming along, welcome, as Anne said. So, I'm a dentist, so a lot of my job is every day helping people who are in pain to get out of pain. Okay, and this today might be what a trip to the dentist looks like. Nice bright surgery, everyone's happy, smiling, it's clean, it's friendly, okay, but depending on when you were born, if you were unlucky enough to need some dental treatment at some time in the past, it might have been very different, okay? So what we're going to talk about briefly tonight is the horrible history of dentistry, okay? So toothaches have been a problem for as long as there have been teeth, really, is this stone carving from about the 13th century demonstrates in Lincoln Cathedral, and this poor chap is destined to point to his painful tooth for all eternity without any help, poor soul. Or you could be like this old bloke from the 19th century who's doubled over at his writing desk with lots of remedies there he's tried to help without any effect. Okay? And we know today that toothache is caused by the bacteria in our mouths using the sugars that we eat to produce acid, and it causes tooth decay, and that's what causes pain. But we didn't always know that. The ancient Egyptians thought that this tiny little tooth worm burrowed inside the tooth and caused lots of pain. Okay, and the Greeks and Romans thought the body contained these four vital liquids that they called humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Okay, and they thought when these were out of balance, that is what caused disease, including toothache. So what they might recommend is something called bloodletting, where they cut the body and let it bleed freely to get rid of an excess of this blood. Okay, but there were lots of different remedies that may or may not have worked, like this from an ancient Chinese text. What it says is, roast a piece of garlic and crush it between the teeth. Mix it with chopped horseradish seeds or saltpeter. Make into a paste with human milk. Form pills and introduce one into the nostril on the opposite side to where the pain is felt. That's disgusting, isn't it? Yeah. So I'm not sure whether that would have worked, or just the fact you had a horrible bit of garlic stuffed up your nose made you forget that your tooth was sore. I don't know. Maybe someone wants to try it next time. Report back. Okay. But for most people, having a toothache meant having a tooth taken out, and there were no dentists in the Middle Ages. The people with the tools of the trade were the barbers with their razor blades, so they might amputate limbs or lance boils or take out your tooth. But it wasn't just the remit of the barber. If you paid the blacksmith enough, with his tongs he might pull your tooth out for you. Okay? I'm sure who you prefer, who's the best bet. There were specialists who called themselves tooth pullers or tooth drawers that would roam from town to town with their instruments and drum up business on these well-appointed carriages with the teeth that they've extracted, adorning the sides of them to demonstrate that they were good tooth pullers and you should go and see them. And they were well dressed and made a spectacle of it and would do this to a crowd as this poor gentleman in his carriage is having his tooth ruined to make him feel better. But it must have been horrible. It must have been really awful. No pain relief, no anesthetics. This poor chap here is tied to the chair to stop him getting up. He's got a jug of ale there as his only remedy. There's a crowd looking on. That's his worried wife in the background as the tooth puller tries to make him better. And it was a struggle as well. It wasn't as easy. We didn't have skilled dentists that were as good as using the instruments and the techniques that they've got today. You can see this poor chap who's really struggling against the the tooth puller is wringing his hands in pain as somebody struggles to get his tooth out. Okay? And that's because the instruments that they used in those days were nothing kind of different to what you might find on a workman's bench, which is tongs that the blacksmith might have. Maybe these are from India in the Middle Ages. But the first instruments that we used to take teeth out, or people used to take teeth out, was this, the dental pelican, so-called, because apparently it looks like a pelican's beak. Now this little hook would be hooked around the inside of the tooth, and this metal bolster secured against the gum, and it used then to lever the tooth out like this. Okay, it doesn't sound very nice at all, does it? Okay, there'd be lots of different types, and a tooth puller might go from town to town with all these instruments. And there were no such thing as sterilisation in those days, a quick rinse off maybe, and they would be used on the next person. Lovely. The next invention was this, in about 1700, the tooth key. And again, this bit would be hooked around the tooth and twisted out of the jaw, so you can see here. Just what you want, isn't it? And it wasn't very effective, actually. The French surgeon Ambroise Paré said this in his writings: "The extraction of a tooth should not be carried out with too much violence, as one risks producing luxation, that's breaking, of the jaw, or concussion of the brain and eyes, or even bringing away a portion of the jaw together with the tooth, not to speak of fever, abscess, abundant hemorrhage, or even death." Great. Lovely. So if you were lucky enough to have survived having your teeth taken out by one of these charlatans, mostly you'd put up with the gap and get on with it. But if you were lucky enough to be rich and survived, you might have some replacement teeth like these. These are ox teeth, strapped onto a gold band which were tied to the teeth next door. Or you might have a denture, replacing all of the teeth, which is carved from whalebone or ivory. And these don't look too bad, but actually they're discoloured horribly and they rotted in the mouth and stank. Another source of teeth were these, extracted teeth from willing volunteers, paid to fill the mouths of rich people. Or even more grisly, the battlefields of Europe, teeth would be taken from dead soldiers. And these were actually referred to as Waterloo teeth for much of the 1800s, because the battles provided a plenty supply of teeth. Okay. So, an example of some dentures here. These are dentures from a famous American from about 1700, late 1700s. And as a clue to whose these might be, the job of these old owners, the old owners of these teeth, their job is now filled by a controversial, floppy-haired American business tycoon. So does anybody think they know whose dentures these might have been? Young man at the back there, the hand up. That's you. Very good. In one. Excellent. There's a prize for you at the end. Well done. That was quick. Very good. Yes, George Washington, the first president of the United States. Now, he had trouble with his teeth for all of his adult life. He wore a number of dentures. Okay. So we've not painted a very nice picture of dentistry here, have we? No. But it had to have changed at some point to get to where we are today. And this was, in most part, due to a series of developments over the 1800s. Well, the first of which was this clever chap called Humphrey Davy, who was looking for a cure for tuberculosis by inhaling some gases. And he found on a day when he had this horrible toothache that when he inhaled this gas, nitrous oxide, he found actually it felt a bit better. And he said this might be something that's useful in surgery. But everyone forgot about that. It wasn't until another about 45 years later that this chap, Horace Wells, who was an American dentist, saw this nitrous oxide being used at a fairground as just entertainment, and he noticed that people under the influence, as they bumped into things on stage, didn't seem to feel any pain, and he volunteered the next day to have his own tooth taken out very selflessly under this, and noticed that actually it was reasonably painless. Great. But it didn't work on everyone, it was quite variable. The next development was this, ether, which is a volatile liquid that's inhaled. And what this other American dentist, William Morton, found was that it can render the patient unconscious, put them to sleep, a general anesthetic. And his patient reported that he felt not a bit of pain after he extracted his tooth and put him into sleep. Brilliant. Not so. Had the annoying habit of killing people, unfortunately, stopped them breathing. And a newer development, or development after that, which might be more familiar, is this. The American surgeon William Halsted used an injection of cocaine in his colleague's jaw to numb it. Now, We use lots of drugs nowadays at the dentist, which are newer and better than cocaine for local anaesthetic you might have heard of, and it stops us feeling pain. Okay? That's what we want. Okay? So with all of these developments and local anaesthetics, which we'll talk about shortly, we've now come to a point where dentistry is as we are today, and you can expect a much more pleasant, nobody disagree please, trip to see the dentist without expecting pain, without having to put up with pain. Okay, but it begs the question, what is pain? How do our bodies feel pain? Why do our bodies feel pain? That's what we're going to hear about just now.
Okay, so why it hurts when we have a toothache? So if you imagine that in our body are millions of nerve cells that we call neurons. An example of a neuron is here, this little guy called Neil. And you can see that Neil has a head. This head is called cell body. And he's like standing on a long leg with feet, which we call axons and dendrites. And the reason why Neil is built this way actually allows him to talk to his colleagues and other neurons, friends of Neil, and they talk to each other and they transmit the information in our body, which essentially results in a perception of pain. It actually hurts. So here on this slide, you have some pictures. That is anatomy of our skin, and that is anatomy of our tooth. The reason why I put it is because if I just talk about toothache, it might be that you never experienced that, no? But I'm sure you touched something hot and then you had to remove your hand very quickly, and that actually was hurting or sometimes burning, no? So if you imagine the situation that you hold your hand above a hot candle, within a few seconds you will remove that hand, right? And the reason why it happens is because pain has very strong protective mechanism here. Pain, we have to feel pain, otherwise we will damage our body. So why this happens? So if you imagine that you hold your hand above hot candle, something happens. So in our skin, here within the layers, we have nerve endings of those nerve cells. And those nerve endings can detect this information about hot candle, but also about other informations I will show you on the next slide. And using those needles, that information can travel in our body and will result in the perception of pain and removal of that hand. And it's a very similar situation to tooth. You can see that inside the tooth, when Susie is experiencing toothache, there are nerve endings, there are nerves, little needles living there that are able to recognize that something is wrong in the tooth, and Susie will experience pain. So you can see here an example of two different nerve cells. And you can see that this nerve cell is quite big, quite fatty, and the reason why it's bigger is because it can transmit the signal much faster. You can see that this signal is traveling quite fast comparing to this one. Here is a nerve cell that doesn't have this coverage. This coverage is called myelin sheath. It's just bare, and therefore it's traveling that signal relatively slower. Those nerve cells also, particularly the nerve endings of those cells, can recognize different stimuli. So can recognize heat, like when you hold your hand above a hot candle, can recognize, for example, burning from a chili pepper. Did you ever cut chili pepper and touched your tongue? It's quite burning sensation, right? So that's actually how our nerve cells can detect that information and allow it to be transported in our body. We also have sensitivity to touch. It's very different if you touch your hand with feather, for example, or a leaf. Or for example, if you are in the workshop, you hit your finger with a hammer, right? That's very different perception of a mechanical stimuli. So anyway, all those nerve cells are specialized in detecting of those informations. But what happens next? So once that information is recognized, and that could be in our skin, or like here in a tooth, that's tooth of Susie, who is experiencing toothache. That information travels in our body from the lower to the upper part of our body, and it reaches brain. In brain, that information goes to different parts of the brain, where that information is recognized and localized, and it results in the perception of pain. And our brain can also send a signal back to our body, for example, to remove hand from the hot candle, not to burn yourself. And you will hear from Wok in the next few minutes about those brain regions which are specialized in recognition and localization of the pain signal. So we're talking today about toothache and the visit to the dentist. So Susie is experiencing tooth pain, right? It's not very pleasant. She's certainly not happy. And those, let's go back, that's too fast. And those Niels are talking to each other. Niels and colleagues are essentially saying it hurts, let's tell brain it's hurting. So her brain recognized that signal and localized this, and it's hurting. But dentistry is much pleasant nowadays, because even if that hurts, we can go to dentist and be subjected to the dental procedure, which actually is not that painful, and then we don't feel much of pain anymore. And why it happened, you heard from James about local anesthetics. So when we go to the dentist, we are injected with the substance called local anesthetic. And what local anesthetic is doing, it's simply blocking those needles to talk to each other. It's like putting a cone between them, and they are not able to transmit that information anymore to brain, and therefore our brain doesn't know that there is anything bad going on in our body. So we thought we will show you some little demonstration, which will be a game for you. And we call it a whisper game. So we will show you what happens, how Niels and colleagues talk to each other, and that information results in pain, or where we block it with the local anesthetics.
So I think we need some volunteers. So, wow.
Yeah, definitely one, no?
Very quick hand.
Let's bring James. Do you want to grab some people from up there? So come with me.
Yeah. So
let's come and place your hand on one of our cones.
yeah.
So,
just
if you stand behind one of the cones and put those in. You come around the front here. And stand in one of these bits. So we've got two teams. The idea is to pass the message between each other as accurately as you can. Yeah. Where's the rest of the... Need some more? Yeah. So we've got two messages, we've got two teams. So you are our pain group. So there are no problems passing the information between each other. In our cone group here, you should all, actually they probably can't hear me because they've all got earplugs in. Come on. Right, we all got earplugs in. Okay. So we're going to tell the first person the message, and the idea is to pass it between you as quickly as possible, okay? Okay. You done there, what? Yeah? Hold on 1 second. Whoa. Are we ready?
We're ready.
Yeah? Okay, go. We should have the countdown clock or something.
again.
Hold on, have we got a problem here? You've not even got earplugs in. You need to pass it. Whatever you think he said, pass on to the next person.
It's a race, guys.
Whatever you... Yeah? Okay. Hold on to that 1 second. Wait, are you good? Yeah? Okay. So, what do you think your message was?
Well, she told me something about signal.
Something about signal, right? Okay. And what do you think your message was? Neurons making electricity. So how did we do in terms of the actual messages, guys?
So that's the first one.
Oh, noisy nerve cells chat to each other with excellent electricity. That's actually not that too bad. And what was the other one? The single solution for troublesome teeth is to see a devoted dentist. So not quite so good. So our pain blocked group didn't do quite so well, but that's exactly what we expected.
I think the winner here was everyone on the audience.
Thank you very much. You can go back to the seat.
We can give them a hand. So you can see even without local anesthesia, there can be troubles. Some people might not be able to feel pain. Sometimes the message gets a little bit confused. Thanks again to the volunteers. Now, as Ilona said, that pain signal from the tooth or from the other parts of your body gets transmitted, gets sent to your brain. And once it reaches the brain, that signal, that message from your body goes to all the different parts of your brain, different regions in the brain. And for our feelings of pain, there are actually a lot of different brain regions that become active, and they help us understand the pain that we're experiencing. Now, to illustrate what some of these regions do, I'm going to try to answer a question that Susie might ask us. So she asks, for example, why do I feel pain here, pointing to her mouth? And I'm sure when you guys experience a toothache, you also have the sensation, the feeling that the pain is coming from your mouth area, your tooth. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this particular part of the brain. This is called the somatosensory cortex, and it's very important for understanding how we feel about pain because it helps us represent the sensations that we feel from all over our bodies. So the somatosensory cortex is illustrated there. I hope everybody can see in red. And my brain is already falling apart. This is I don't know if you guys can see. This is my brain falling apart. So the brain, of course, has two hemispheres, and I've lost my left hemisphere. And what we can see here is I tried to highlight where the somatosensory cortex is. And so you guys can see, this is really my bad job. It looks like I did a very bad job bandaging up the brain area. But you can see how the somatosensory cortex comes from this one side of the brain and wraps around the inside surface there. Now the somatosensory cortex, so let's have a closer look at the somatosensory cortex. I'm going to take a slice of that cortex, and I'm going to focus on that part of the somatosensory cortex. Now, as I mentioned before, the somatosensory cortex is very important for body sensations. It tells us where on the body we're experiencing sensations. And what you can see here is that different body parts, like our toes, our fingers, our lips, are actually represented by very specific tissue, brain tissues, in the somatosensory cortex. So that pain message, that pain signal from your tooth will be sent, that message will be sent, ooh, wrong button. Wow. that pain signal will be sent to this part of the brain. That part of the brain tissue in the somatosensory cortex will become more active because of the signal being sent from the tooth. And this is why Susie would feel pain here in her mouth. Now, just a question. Does anybody notice anything interesting or special about the somatosensory cortex as shown here in this picture? Sorry, say that again? Yeah, that's correct. So we can see that there's the whole body is represented. Anything else that you've noticed?
Some parts of the body are more sensitive to ill touch, pain, heat than others. For example, the hands are particularly large, whilst the legs or torso are particularly short.
Wow, you can give this lecture. That's a perfect answer. So you can see how for different parts of the body, like the hands, there's more brain tissues dedicated to that particular part of the body. And as you nicely answered, because there's more tissue dedicated to an area of the body, your hands, for example, would be more sensitive to the sense of touch than, for example, your toes. I don't know if you've ever tried to touch anything with your toes, but you probably would be much better at feeling things with your hands than with your toes. One of the reasons for that is because you have a lot more brain tissue, brain area within somatosensory cortex that allows you to have that higher sensitivity. Now what we do as psychologists is then we can represent, we can try to represent that sensitivity of the different body areas, body parts, and we call this with a very strange name, we call it the brain homunculus. So the larger the body part is shown, the more sensitive that part is. So your hands are the most sensitive, your mouth and your lips are actually quite sensitive as well. The good side is that you can feel things better with your hands or with your mouth, but it might also mean that because there's more brain tissues, brain areas for those different parts, you might actually experience more pain. So it might hurt more, you might experience more pain. Now, the size of this homunculus is very unique to individuals. Some people might have much more sensitive hands compared to their lips. Others might have very much less sensitivity in their hands. And as psychologists, we can actually measure that. So you can actually build your own homunculus for each individual. So this is our very high-tech homunculus building device. It's just a card with lots of toothpicks stuck to it. And you can see that there are different distances between the pairs of toothpicks. And what we would expect is that it can measure how sensitive different parts of your body is. So for example, if I do this, I can feel that there's 2 points on my arm. But if I use a smaller distance, I might not be able to feel that. I might feel that as a single point. So if I can feel it as 2 points, that part of the body would be sensitive. And if I feel it as 1 point, then that would be less sensitive. And we have different distances between these points. Now what I'm going to ask is for maybe a teacher volunteer this time. So that teachers can get involved. It would be great to have a teacher come on. If the students yell out the loudest, we can. We just need one volunteer. Oh, let's give him a hand of applause. Thank you. Or do you, who wants to poke? If you,
seat as well.
yeah. This is not for bad behavior. He's a very nice volunteer. What's your name, sorry?
Mr. Ward.
Mr. Ward. Thank you, Mr. Ward. Now, before we start, Mr. Ward, you get to choose the person you would like. Is there any particular?
No.
No?
I guess I go for the one with the blue shirt.
This
Blue
one.
shirt seems
All right. So this is Mr. Ward's homunculus. So what I'm going to ask you to do, what's going to happen is that you're going to close your eyes. Ilona will go through different parts of your body and just poke you in a very gentle way. And all you have to say is, do you feel 1 point or do you feel 2 points? But you have to keep your eyes closed. No cheating, of course. And we'll just keep poking you until you say there's 1 point. Okay. Please don't try this at home or do it in a safe environment. So we'll close our eyes and we'll start with your forehead. 2. 2.
1.
15. So your head size is 15, so that's already 15. Okay, so let's go to your arms, please. Maybe if you can roll up your sleeve, that would be great. Are you guys excited to see Mr. Ward's homunculus? Close your eyes.
2.
13. Don't let you should keep your eyes closed until the and that will do your hand, the palm of your hand. So close your eyes again. Ooh, look at this. All right, the last part will be your legs. Your kids love it. Don't worry, your students love it. We'll just do the calf. Okay, so nothing. Okay, and that is Mr. Ward's unique homunculus. You can have a look if you want. I don't know if you want to have a look. So the larger the body part, thank you very much, Mr. Ward. So again, the larger the body part, the more sensitive that part is. So his hands were very sensitive, so they're very large. His arms was the least sensitive, so they're very tiny, as you can see there. Now for teachers or parents, I do have a little instruction sheet in that folder there, so you can build your own very exciting homunculus building device. There's some instructions there. In hospitals, they do this for people that might have pain injuries. So they actually look like this, so it looks a little bit more clever, but these would be what doctors and medical clinicians use. But I do think these look much cooler in my mind. On this instruction sheet, there's also the website where you can go and enter your results, so you can see so you can build your own homunculus yourself. Okay. So we saw how we've learned a little bit about how neurons, nerve cells in the body part, like your tooth, can send signals, these pain signals, these messages to the brain And then that parts, different brain regions, try to interpret those pain signals to help us know where the pain is coming from. Now, a very important question is, can we, or how can we peek inside your brain and to see some of these electrical, to sort of measure these neurons and to measure the activities that are going on in your brain when you're experiencing pain. Now, one method that we can use in the hospitals or in the laboratory is something called electroencephalography. This is EEG. And this allows us to listen to those electrical activity of neurons talking to each other. So here's our neurons again. And they communicate with each other through using electricity. And we can use EEG to listen in onto those, listen to this activity. Now, how does EEG work? I'll just briefly explain that. In our brains, we have millions and millions of neurons all over the brain, and these neurons talk to each other through electricity, and so they produce an electric current. At some point, I'll learn how to press the right button. So it's producing. Our brain is constantly producing electric current. Now, if we place a very special sensor on the scalp of our brain, we can actually measure that electricity. So yes, right now, as you're listening to me, your brain is producing a lot of electricity. Well, maybe not enough to power a light bulb, for example, but there is electricity coming that can be measured from your scalp with these very special sensors. So these sensors allow us to measure these electric current changes over time. They're just, so you can imagine these little fluctuations. Sometimes the electrical current increases, sometimes it decreases. We have special EEG caps, as you can see illustrated here. It works for us, and it also, babies seem to love it a lot. But it allows us to measure the electric current all over the scalp. And this is something like you would get. Now, each of these waves, each of these lines represents one of those sensors. So we're able to measure the electrical activity being produced on the scalp by neurons deep inside your brain. Now, of course, this looks quite complicated. It's just a bunch of squiggly lines. How do we make sense of all of this electrical activity? Now, luckily for us, there are messages hidden within the changes in the electric current. Now, what we discovered in the past is that some of these changes in the electric current occurs very, very slowly. You can almost imagine a tortoise, the speed of a tortoise walking across the floor. Other changes can be much faster, like a hare or a rabbit. And then, of course, there are these really, really fast changes in the electric current, much like a cheetah. So if you compare the speed of a cheetah to the speed of a tortoise, that would be sort of the differences between these waves. Now, these changes in the electric current tells us the speed, the speed in which these electric currents changes tells us something about our emotion, how we're feeling. So, for example, we might be feeling relaxed and calm. We might be alert. Maybe we're a little bit drowsy. And they also have special names. So the slow changes we call delta waves or theta waves. The faster changes we can call alpha waves or beta waves. So these are the names that we've come up with. Now, I thought it would be interesting to try to illustrate these waves with one of our last little game, and this is a game for the entire audience. So we're going to have our volunteers, Anne, James, and Ilona. So Anne, if you stand here, James in the middle. Elona on the side. Now, I'm going to get you, what we're going to be doing is we'll be clapping, and the 3 volunteers will be your lead, and they'll be clapping at these different speeds, slow, fast, and really fast. Now, what I want you to do is follow one of them, and I realize that we can use the chairs that you're sitting in right now as our selection process. So if you're sitting on a green chair, just have a look at your chair. If you can follow Anne, just watch Anne's clapping. Don't do it yet, we'll watch Anne. If you're on a light gray chair, if you could follow James. So just when you're clapping, follow James. And then of course the dark gray chair, you can follow Ilona. Is that clear? So Anne is the green, she's the tortoise. She's going to be clapping slowly. So if you're green, tortoise, slow. If you have a light gray chair, you'll be following James, who is the hare. And he's going to be fast. And Ilona will be, it will be the challenging ones for the dark chairs, following Ilona, the cheetah. And then we'll go through different conditions as you illustrate what's happening in your brain and how we can use this electrical current changes to understand how you feel. So let's just get everybody clapping. If everybody just follows me and just clap. Okay, now Anne's going to start. Remember, if you're green, so you're going to go slow. Everybody else just keep clapping. Okay, now start following James. Now start following Ilona. And let's lower the volume a little bit. Follow the rhythm. Okay. Now what happens when you close your eyes, for example, is let's get the rabbits to clap louder. So try to follow James, but louder. So this is what happens when you close your eyes. Now, if you're doing homework, you might be alert. So you're going to follow Ilona. So everybody, all the cheetahs, all the dark hair, follow loud. Let's see if you guys can make it louder. All right. And now, I haven't forgotten the tortoises, the green chair. Everybody keep chapping. Okay, now for the slow clappers. Really loud. You're getting drowsy. I could do this for ages. All right, thank you very much. Thank you to our volunteers. And thanks to everybody there for joining in. So you can see that it's quite amazing that this is almost what's happening in the brain. There's all of these all these changes going on all over your brain, as you can see here. And some of the waves will be louder than other waves, and it's just telling us how you're feeling or what state you're in. But remember, we're measuring all of this information. We're measuring these changes in electric current on the scalp. And these changes are reflecting the activity of neurons deep inside your brain, the millions and millions of neurons in your brain. And that's what's really important. We also need to know excuse me, where in the brain all of this activity is occurring. And one way we can do this is to use an MRI scanner, a magnetic resonance imaging and magnetic resonance scanner, and this allows us to look inside the brain. So we can get a picture of your brain, the structure of your brain, and we can actually also find out where the brain activity is occurring. Now here's an example of a brain slice. And what I'm going to do is just, we can show you slices of the brain, and these slices are just basically going up the brain like that. And this animation will try to highlight that. So what you're seeing here is that I'm moving up the brain from the bottom to the top. The bright colors that you see, the warm colors that you see reflects increases in brain activity in that brain region. And the bluish color, the cool colors, represent decreases in the brain activity. And this activity tells us that the neurons there, for example, are active. So let's quickly, so how do we use that information? How do we listen to the brain and look inside the brain when you're experiencing a toothache, for example? Now remember, we can use EEG. Here's our nice subject with the EEG cap. And if we measure the activity, we can listen in on the alpha waves and theta waves of this person when they're peacefully at rest. So what happens when you have a toothache? We can put on a nice exciting EEG cap. And what we find is that there's changes. The pain in your tooth changes these alpha waves and these theta waves, for example. So the alpha waves gets quieter, and the theta waves, for example, gets louder, similar to the examples that we went through with the clapping. Now we also need to know where in the brain these activity changes are occurring. So when you're experiencing a toothache, again, remember that all of these different areas of your brain become more active. And this activity of these different brain regions are changing your brain waves. So just as a quick wrap up, why do toothaches? That was our original question with our friend Susie here. And these are the 3 key messages. So remember, neurons send pain signals to your brain. So from the tooth, these nerve cells will send the pain signal to the brain. Some of the regions within your brain will become more active. For example, the somatosensory cortex. And because of that change in the activity of the somatosensory cortex or other brain regions, then that's going to change your brain wave. And combine all of this together helps Susie understand why she feels pain and why she feels the pain, where she feels it. So what we're going to do now, we'll do a quick 3-4 minute demonstration. We're going to do a live demonstration of listening to our brain waves with our lovely volunteer, Natalie. Now this is a special sensor where there's a little transmitter here, so it's actually going to communicate with the laptop. I think I saw a hand there. Was there going to be a question?
My question was, can you actually measure pain?
That's a very good question. What do you think?
Maybe not.
So pain is that's a very good question, because pain is such a subjective experience. Everybody will experience pain differently. Now, if you're playing a game, for example, you might not feel your toothache, but if you're not doing anything, you might feel a toothache. So what psychologists and clinicians do is they can sometimes use special scales that the person can indicate how intense they feel the pain. So it could be as simple as on a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain do you feel? Now I introduced these techniques like EEG and MRI because the intensity of pain that you experience is often reflected in the loudness of the alpha waves, for example. So in some sense, the EEG measure allows us to measure the pain that the person is experiencing. So the more pain you feel, the smaller your alpha activity, the quieter your alpha waves are. Similarly with the MRI, the more intense you feel the pain, the more activity. There's a much larger increase. So these are some of the ways we can try to measure this very subjective experience of pain. We can use a scale, a rating scale from 1 to 10, or we can use sort of these measures using EEG or MRI. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, let's just do a quick demo and then I'll take any more questions. It's not going on the whole screen for some reason. That's okay. So what you're seeing there, so this is a live demonstration of Natalie's electrical current activity coming from her forehead. So if you just move your head a little bit, you can see that changes. Obviously, the muscles will produce electrical activity, and that'll change that. If you blink, for example, that usually causes electrical activity changes. It's probably hard to demonstrate live, but if she relaxes for a few minutes, there will be an increase in that alpha waves, for example. But this is the kind of activity that we would be measuring, and so we can use EEG, for example, to try to measure pain as best as we can. Are there any other questions? I think we can open up the floor for a few questions. Thanks, Natalie. We can open up the floor for a few questions. If you wait for a microphone. Ask the dentist.
When you showed the diagram of alpha and beta waves, it looked awfully similar. What would be the telltale ways to tell the difference between an alpha wave and a beta wave?
So there's quantitative ways we can measure. There's a certain frequency. There's the rate of change. How quickly things change can be measured more precisely. But you're right. We have to set. There's a certain range of change for these different frequency bands. So for example, for alpha waves, the average change is about 10 changes per second, whereas beta waves might be something like 20 changes per second. So there would be a difference on average of about 10. The speed difference would be about twice as fast for beta waves compared to alpha waves. Any other questions? We have maybe one or two more. Oh, there's one there.
Just to your left.
I was just wondering, some people experience pain without there actually being anything physically wrong or apparently to be physically wrong. And I just wondered how is that explained with the way that the cortex works?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Remember that when we do have a cause of the pain, when we put our hands on a hot stove, for example, there's a signal going from our hands to our brain. Sometimes when there's damage to the nerve or other medical problems, these nerves might be firing without any stimulation, and our brains interpret that as pain, even though we're not physically experiencing pain. As Ilona said, the important thing is that we feel pain so that we can react and protect our bodies. But sometimes there's problems, or we get damaged in a way where the nerve cells become active all the time, so they're constantly sending pain signals to the brain, and we experience, in this case, we would experience chronic pain, for example. Maybe one more question?
On this side. Do you mind just there, just in there?
How is the electricity light created from the neutron?
From the neurons. Well, that's a tough one.
Good question.
It's a chemical signal, no? It's a chemical signal that is changing into electrical signal later. So it's called action potential, essentially. So the neuron can fire if there is a certain change of ion. So our cells essentially has ion inside of the cells and outside of the cells. And as the membrane potential of that cell is changing, the ions can travel. And there is a certain threshold that is required when those ions can travel, and it's called threshold. And once that reach the threshold, it's called propagation threshold, the action potential will be generated, which will allow sodium ions to travel into the cells and potassium travel outside of the cells. And that's essentially how the action potential travels. And now, remember I showed this picture of Emil, which is a bit fatty. So it has this myelin sheet on its axon. And essentially myelin sheets are kind of like built around the axon in blocks. So that action potential can travel between those blocks in myelin sheet. and the signal can travel, and that's essentially how that travels between the neurons.
That's the lecture.
Yeah?
Okay. I think we might have to wrap it up. Yeah, I know some of you need to catch buses and so on. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
And again, remember to listen to your dentist or your friends. So please remember to listen to your dentist. And for teachers or parents or for anybody, there's a few handouts if you would like.